Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start exactly on time because this is a long talk with a lot of slides, and I'm going to be talking fast. So as Captain Kirk sometimes says, buckle up. So I'm going to be talking about this subject of a geographer's guide to building game worlds. A lot of people know me as the executive director of the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA. Actually, in my career in the game industry, I'm actually a geographer and cartographer who's worked in the industry for over 20 years. When I was at Microsoft for 13 years, I ran a team that I created called Geopolitical Strategy. My job for the company was to protect them against political and cultural risks. And in that process, I became a creative partner with Microsoft and with the game developers to basically help them create worlds that are going to work in the different markets in which you want to make money. Now, obviously, I'm looking more from a reactive side, and I've given talks before about this topic that I call culturalization, mainly from the perspective of things that you should not do. But what I wanted to do in this talk was be more prescriptive and talk about things you should do. So when you're thinking about making a world, I'm going to kind of touch on very high-level things that you should be thinking about, and especially introducing a couple of concepts that may or may not be new to you, but they're concepts that we use in geography quite a bit. One of the things I will preface this and say is that there's no way I can get to a great deal of depth in this because this is a massive subject, as you all know. Building worlds is very complicated. So this is going to be kind of an overview. I will try and leave time for questions as well. But like I said, I'm going to kind of touch on the high-level issues, but undoubtedly there's a lot of details in here. So, we're very familiar with a lot of game worlds. How we define game world is sometimes up to a subjective interpretation, but there's a lot of different things that we've been exposed to in the game industry over the years. Amazing recreations of real-world history, real-world locations, amazing things that you can build and create on the fly and, basically lose your kids in this. Really cool visualizations of worlds that don't necessarily have to have all of the level of detail, which we'll talk about here, but they're still effective for what the world needs to accomplish. And of course, other worlds that are just completely otherworldly. They are ones that don't exist, they exist in the imagination, they exist in the science fiction universe or wherever, but they also are interesting to realize. And of course, even a lot of casual games, this is a world, I'm using that term in a general sense of the theater or the arena or milieu or whatever you want to call it, in which our games are created, in which the narrative takes place, in which the action takes place, in which the player engages with your creative vision. And so this is just as valid as the other slides that I've showed. This is a world that has a certain logic to it. And of course, something like this, which is a pretty accurate representation of a Los Angeles-like city. And so there's a lot of different things we can look at. Now, going back to this map, I'm sure all of us know what this is. A lot of us, this is probably one of the first things we've ever been exposed to in terms of a created world and a created universe, and something that felt incredibly real to us. Now, this is actually Tolkien's original drawing of Middle-earth that he did. And if you look in a little more detail, and of course, a lot of us could probably draw this from memory that we've seen it so much, whether you've read the books or you've watched the movies or whatever the case may be. But there's a reality here that he has built. And of course, it's not just the map alone that creates the reality of Middle-earth. It's also the narrative, it's the characters, it's the history, it's the lore, it's the language, it's all the other layers that Tolkien created to make this a very real feeling kind of place. And so I will get back to this map a little bit later, but I know for myself as a total geek and also someone who's very interested in maps, it was Tolkien's map that actually led me to pursue cartography as a career, because I just love the fact that he made something completely unreal look completely real by using a method of cartography. And of course, there's a lot of other storytellers that have come along that have done their own versions, and a lot of fantasy worlds. It's just, how many fantasy worlds, when you open up the first book of the series, there's a map? Because it's the writer is trying to show you that this is a realized version of my imagination. I love this Google Maps version of Westeros. It's really cool. Whatever it might be, there's all of these fictional realms that people have created, a lot in literature and film or wherever you want them to be. And I could go on for days and days with examples, but basically in a lot of these cases, the realism that they're trying to create and the world that they're trying to build for you to present their narrative, present their story, was to give a sense of authenticity. It's almost like when they're showing you the map in their book or whatever it might be, it's almost as like they're saying, I was there. I saw these things. I made this map. It's almost, that's why one of the brilliance of Tolkien's vision is that Tolkien's map, it's almost like it feels so real that he was there. He actually did the cartography because he went there. And so to be able to convey that sense, because as cartographers, that's exactly what we do. We have surveying, we have instruments that collect data, we have satellites that do imagery, we have all these different methods now that collect the data, and then the cartographer compiles them into a map that basically is a way to say, hey, look, we know what's there. Or the cartographer themselves would say, I was there, although in these days it's not really the case anymore because so many things are automated with cartography. And of course, in being a geek of, this is in Norway, we also ascribe fictional place to real place as well, because they become so ingrained in popular culture. And the world that was realized on the screen is also a world that has been somewhat realized on the ground. Or like going to Tunisia and being there on Tatooine, which I know Tunisian friends, they know it's Tunisia, it's not Tatooine. Stop calling us Tatooine. But it's just such a real place because of what was constructed in the narrative that was built around it. One of the things I really want to emphasize about world building, it is not about realism. It's really about realization over realism. Because I think a lot of times, when I've talked and worked with a lot of developers on many, many franchises over the past 20 years, a lot of them tend to focus on the realism aspect, that world building equals detail. That's not the case at all. Detail is a function of what serves the narrative later on, and we'll talk about detail later. But it's really about the notion of realization. What does the world need to be to serve the narrative that you want to create and what the experience you want to convey? And so really it's a function of taking the narrative goals that you have, because generally speaking there is a narrative. Even in a game, something like Angry Birds, there is a narrative in that game. And maybe at first it really wasn't there, it is, but you can kind of get some sense of it. Even in like you play something like Bejeweled Blitz, it's not necessarily meant to be a narrative-driven game, but there is a kind of underlying lore in that game, like the different levels and the names of the levels and things like that. And you're kind of makes you wonder, what does this relate to? It doesn't really matter because I'm going to go play again. But so you take the narrative goals and you also take the goals of the experience, because these are distinct things. So for example, I'm not going to go into this topic because there's no time for it, but a lot of VR right now, a lot of VR demonstrations that we've seen to me are experiences, they're not narratives. There are things where you have a certain feeling, a certain experience within that space, but it's not really conveying a narrative, a plot, or some kind of, we're getting there, we are getting there slowly. But in a lot of games that we make, though, it is a combination of this notion of we have a narrative for the space, and we have a space in which we want certain things to be experienced by the player. Those things may not always relate to the core narrative. Sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. But ultimately, it kind of helps shape what does the world need to be? What does it have to be realized in order for this world to work for your vision? So there's a quick recipe for realizing worlds. So we're going to talk in some detail about some of these. So, and this is, I'm presenting this like a recipe. So first you start with a suggestion of familiarity. So, going back to Tolkien's map as an example, his map looks like it could be something real. It's not completely fantastical like Dr. Seuss. I mean, it looks like something that could be familiar to us because we're used to seeing maps that are drawn like that, or we're used to seeing mountain ranges like that. We also take a hint of complex systems. So a lot of worlds, we know that our world is incredibly complex. There are so many interrelated systems and complexity out there. We cannot represent all of those in a game, but we kind of hint at those by different things. There's all kinds of techniques that we do that, by artifacts that are in the environment, by hints that are dropped in the narrative, by characters that show up, and maybe the characters reveal a certain aspect of that world that the player had no idea existed. We also have a dash of cultural evidence. So oftentimes, because a lot of games do involve some kind of culture, whether it actually involves people, whether it involves aliens or animals or whatever it might be, there's a sense of culture, that there's been an inhabitants, there has been some kind of presence in this game. It's not just an open biosphere of animals and plants. There's something else there that kind of makes it evidence. I mean, I think like the Halo games were, in my opinion, were very cool in this way because they were the Forerunner artifacts that were strewn around the Halo ring that kind of gave evidence that something had happened here, but we never really got to know, at least in the initial games, what was going on. And we need a big chunk of logical consistency in the recipe. And I will talk more specifically about, I'm going to talk more specifically about cultural evidence, logical consistency, and the other one, which is a pinch of topology. Topology, it means connectedness. And if you've heard the term topology, oftentimes we hear it in network topology, where network engineers talk about the connectedness of devices. In geography, we use topology as a sense of connectedness of things, of attributes, of places. And again, I'll talk about that more. Now, cultural evidence. So basically what this means is taking the minimal amount of content you need to convey the presence of an in-game culture. So this is really key to setting the context of the game. So, and I'll give an example in a minute. This requires logical consistency to be effective, and so you're going to need to know what that is. We'll talk about that in a minute. The highest risk activity in game development today, in my opinion, doing this kind of work, is this notion of building cultural evidence in a game. So let me explain a little bit more. So let's say, for example, the narrative designers wrote the script. So you've got the script, you know what the characters are going to do, you know what they're going to say, you know the basic plot, maybe you know what vehicles are going to be needed, or weapons, or whatever it might be, artifacts, all that kind of stuff. But then you kind of let loose the designers and artists and say, okay, make this world feel real. Make it feel realized. Make it feel like it actually exists in something, you know, that's not just, you know, some lines drawn on paper without much detail in there. So we kind of backfill, this notion of backfilling. So for example, like if you have like a medieval environment, you don't just have the buildings, you might have like stacks of hay, you might have some barrels, you might have some other stuff, you might have some banners hanging from buildings and flags, you might have little animals running around. All of this kind of detail that fills in the world and kind of gives it a sense of actuality, that's what I call backfilling. And this is a very high-risk activity because oftentimes it's not checked by the main designers of the game. And so a lot of times game developers are under so much time pressure to do this activity that they just start throwing stuff in there as much as they can. Of course, this depends on the game. If the game is going to be hyper-detailed, they're going to be under incredible pressure to fill in the game. Think of a game like Skyrim and the amount of stuff that is in Skyrim, pots and papers and books with text in them and all that kind of stuff. All of that has to be realized in the process of building the cultural evidence for that world, because that's what helps Skyrim feels like an actual realized place. And so this can be a risky activity because people just kind of randomly create things. There's two key tips for creating evidence that I'll pass along right away. One is you don't be lazy. And I'm sorry, but that's the only word for it. So, and I'll give you an example in just a minute about being lazy. So you need to create everything with a purpose. It's not just, we'll just throw some barrels in there. It's like, why? Why are the barrels there? Which leads to the second point, ask questions. So it's really important, and I know it's very difficult in the game industry to ask an artist, for example, it's like, why did you draw the character that way? I don't understand that. Because we have a mutual respect for creative vision, but at the same time, there are certain points at which it's completely valid to ask, why does it look that way? What does that symbol mean? What does that flag mean? Why is that faction green? I mean, questions like that, just because you have an understanding to basically understand your own complexity and not just make it a random act. And I'll kind of get into a little bit later why random acts of creation can be dangerous. So here's a cultural evidence piece. So this is a screenshot from Jade Empire. And Jade Empire was a Pan-Asian world that supposedly had nothing to do with our world other than kind of felt like it was Asian. And I won't go into all the complexity of making this game, but it was a real challenge. But you can see these glowing blue cylinders on the side there. Well, this was an aspect of the backfilling of the game. So what they did is, because it was a Pan-Asian environment, they threw prayer wheels from Tibetan Buddhism into this hallway. Well, there wasn't Buddhism in this game. okay? This is not the real world. So they threw these artifacts into the environment just to kind of flesh it out and add something there, and yet that was not part of this world. It's not valid. And so, this is what the actual prayer wheels look like. And so the previous ones, they actually did look like prayer wheels, but then they kind of fixed it and made this blue weird glow, so it looks sort of like this energy thing going on. But this is an example of an artist kind of throwing something there, saying, well, this whole environment looks kind of like Tibetan Buddhism, so I'm going to put prayer wheels in there. But those prayer wheels have a specific meaning in the real world, and they probably don't belong in a game that has a more fantasy setting. Logical consistency. This is incredibly important. If there is one thing that I see game designers and artists and writers do wrong more than anything else when they're creating a world, is they don't build in logical consistency. So this is basically the notion that rules exist and are applied to the space, time, and all elements within that world. This is something Tolkien did really well, even though, yeah, there's some exceptions there, and I'm going to point one out in a little bit. But there is a sense that the world works, that there is a system that works. Just like the way our world, we know certain things work in certain ways. We know how plate tectonics works, more or less. We know kind of how the weather sort of works. We know how transportation systems seem to go right or wrong. We know all that kind of stuff. And so that helps a world feel real by building in a logical consistency. There's a lack of contradiction in the system, so it's like you're not going to come across something that just makes no sense at all in the world. It's like the things that are in the world feel like they're supposed to be in that world. There's also a lack of conflict between the content elements that comprise the world. So, if you're not going to have something where it feels completely incongruous, that you'd have a culture, you'd have like a culture that represents that is like from the Nordic areas, from a cold area, living in a complete hot desert area. Something like that. I mean, maybe there's a reason for it, but that's what I'm saying. Where's the logic? So if you're going to do something like that, make sure there's a logic for doing it, because that kind of stuff, does tend to kick the player out of the experience. And they kind of step back and say, WTF, I don't understand this. This doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't really have a sense of realness, which in that sense of realness and the realization helps draw players into the game. And we also want to talk about the fidelity relationships between, whoa, slow down there, Tex. Sorry, I don't know what just happened there. Yeah, that's unfortunate. So anyway, we also want to talk about topology. But here's an example of logical consistency. So it's kind of like the example from Jade Empire. So this is from Cameo, which was on the original Xbox. And you can see here, now this is another world that had absolutely nothing to do with our world. It's a complete fantasy world. And so is it logical that you would have grave markers that are wooden crosses in this world? Maybe there's a good reason why there's wooden crosses being used in this particular universe, but I can tell you the answer is that this was a case of creative laziness. The artist, when I pointed this out, saying, what are those supposed to be? And they said, well, of course, they're grave markers. And I said, what do you mean, of course? There's no Christianity in this universe, so how would I know that? And their answer to me was, what else would I use? And I'm like, I don't know, you're the artist. Maybe you draw something different. So that's one of those things where this is not logically consistent with the universe. It has no place there. It's a content element that really should not be there. And then, of course, topology. So this is essential. This is kind of a more subtle point to world building where there's a sense that things relate to one another. It's not like you just have all these random content elements, random cultures, random objects in the world that don't really seem to fit together. And so, I know I've heard some people accuse Tolkien, and I'm going to keep, using Tolkien as an example because he is a good example. I've heard some people accuse Tolkien of having a topology that sometimes feels weird because, like, why are there dwarves and elves and humans and all these things living in this? It doesn't seem to make sense. But if you read the Silmarillion, he kind of explains all of that. So he does have a whole backstory that explains why it's all there. So part of it is that the people who say that, it's like, well, you didn't get the full story. You need to go back and read. But topology is important because it gives us a sense of that interconnectedness of different things, like a culture, like the people to the land. How do the people in the game, if there is a people culture, how do they relate to the environment? Or are they just there without any kind of, seeming connection? And we know that, that helps build a sense of realness to the game. And it applies to everything. It's not just about the relationship of places either. I'm not just talking about the actual distance between a place. That really doesn't matter because topology is agnostic of distance. It's all about the actual connection. What is connected to what and how is it connected to it? And so that's really important to kind of flesh that out. And it does help to convey a sense of a much broader universe. So even if you hint that there is a connection by dropping a line from a non-player character or by finding an artifact that might relate to different things in the game, that kind of helps build the sense of lore, helps build a sense that this universe is a lot bigger than the player might initially imagine. So there's 3 core steps to world building that I want to cover. One is to set the context. So I'm actually going to spend a good deal of time on this issue of real world versus fictional world, because this tends to be one of the areas where I see a lot of designers get hung up in terms of what they do next, in terms of how they build out their content. The second one is determine the level of complexity. So again, this is not about realism, it's about realization. How much is needed to actually make the world serve the narrative and serve the experience goals? And then lastly is about creating with intent. So then we talk about what you actually do, building the world layers. I'm not going to spend as much time on that part because that can go on for weeks, and we don't have time for that. So let's talk about this notion about real world and fictional world. Now, I realize this is a very strong dichotomy I'm putting here, but I do fully realize that this is a broad zone of overlap. It's very much the same way people are arguing about VR versus AR and blah, blah, blah. It's like it's a spectrum. There's certain degrees of overlap. I mean, you can have things that take place in the real world like a lot of games do, but there's a very fantastical fictional things that happen on top of that real world. But my reason for making this dichotomy, though, is really important, because if you base things in the real world, in our world, I keep saying real world. I don't want to get into some kind of metaphysical argument about that term today. But when you base things in our known world, it does have an effect on the content and the perception of the content and a lot of other things that we'll talk about. The fictional world, you have a lot more freedom, but it can also be dangerous because you also don't have boundaries. So you can basically kind of go off on a tangent and create something that might be completely problematic for people who are playing the game in our world. Yeah, this is confusing really fast. Anyway, in the world of cartography, we know this very well, this whole fictional versus real world setting. So, these are 2 versions of Google Maps, and Google was one of my clients, and when I was there, we were perfecting what we call domain tailoring. So you can see here in the US locale, when you go to Google Maps, and for most of the world, you see the northern area of India, Jammu and Kashmir, is disputed. So you can see the dashed lines around the disputed territories up there, because it's disputed between Pakistan, India, and China. Well, in India, by law, you must show Jammu and Kashmir as Indian territory. This is non-negotiable. You must do this, or else your product will not sell in India. The government will ban it. And so what I call this is what I call a geopolitical imagination. This doesn't exist. It exists in the political world of the Indian government, but it does not exist on the ground. And so this is, in a way, this is kind of a fictional world. This doesn't really exist. So it might be almost as fictional as Tolkien's map. So there's some differences between real world and fictional world in creation that I'm going to touch on. And for the sake of time, this is highly generalized. So that's another thing cartographers do, is we generalize a lot because you can't show everything on a map. So I'm generalizing my own talk a little bit. So anyway, differences in world creation between doing real world and fictional world creation. So with the real world, the primary emphasis is often on replication and authenticity. So you want it to feel like it's a real place. There was a game like 6 Days in Fallujah, which you may have heard about, which never got released because it perfectly recreated the Battle of Fallujah in 2004 in Iraq. And it was controversial because of it, because it was a controversial battle. And the publisher was just like, I'm not touching this. We're not going to release this. And so it was very authentic, and it replicated the city exactly, and yet, that was a problem for it. In the fictional world, the primary emphasis tends to be more on the imagination and distinction. So we want new things. We don't necessarily want stuff that we've already seen in the real world. We want to see things that have never existed before. That's where we kind of crank on our imagination, and we want these things to be distinct from what we know in the real world, because that distinction actually makes them, stand out more. And in the consumption, basically on the player side, so the differences in the world consumption is when you're playing the game when you're playing a real world game, it's basically the focus is on realism and the experience that feels genuine. Like, wow, I'm really driving this tank. I'm really sniping that person's head off. That kind of thing. I should use nicer examples. But, what's wrong with me? So, and in the fictional world, it's focused on discovery and escapism. So of course, we all know that No Man's Sky just was released, and a lot of the both praise and criticism of the game is focused on that issue, that it's like too much discovery and too much escapism, but some people love that and some people don't. So then that's, a whole different issue. But that tends to be what a lot of fictional worlds are more focused on, because that's one of the values of it. Discoverability, let me just touch on that issue really quick. So what I mean by discoverability, which is another critical issue when we're creating content, is when you have a content element in the game, let's say it's something that could be potentially offensive to a certain culture, or maybe it just does not in the right place. Maybe it shouldn't be there. But this was a game in Tekken Fighter where they had the inscriptions, the Arabic script for Allah on the floor. And so, now how discoverable is it though? That's the issue here. Because if you look at these tiles, when you're up here, your eyes are up here fighting, are you going to notice it in the tiles? And that's open to interpretation. Some people might notice, as some people did, and some people may not. And so, depending, sometimes you'll put content elements into your environment that might be controversial, or they might be, edgy or something, but sometimes you're not going to see them. And this is actually one of the things I do a lot when I do my consulting work in this area, is I look for things that most people are never going to see. And the only way I can do that is because I've got like God mode tools when I'm actually in the environment during one of the game builds, so I can turn around and look at places that no one's ever going to see, or probably will never going to see. So let's talk a little more about real world context, because I want to make this distinction. So setting games in our world. So the primary issues that we have with the real world when it comes to the content, number one is augmentation. And I'm going to give an example of all of these things. So augmentation is like taking something that actually exists and adding to it, like adding some fictional elements to it. Accuracy, of course, is what it says. Like, is the character accurate? Is that building accurate? Is that event accurate, the historical event? Interpretation, so how different cultures interpret a real world thing, whether it's a gesture, like this gesture, it means different things in different countries. Or appropriateness as well, like, is this subject matter actually appropriate to have in the game? So here's one from Ninja Gaiden 2 where it was interesting because in this game it was sort of a hyper real world. It was supposed to be the real world, but I call it hyper real because a lot of the buildings were not the way they really are. So this is a part of the Kremlin that was enhanced. It was given extra layers. And so it's like so you would maybe recognize it as the Kremlin, but maybe not because it's been enhanced in some way. And this can be dangerous because if you take the wrong object and enhance it or augment it in a certain way, that might not work, especially if it's a sacred site, if it's a church or a mosque or a synagogue or some place like that, or if it's a burial site or something like that. You have to be really careful about what you do to actual locations because it can be very sensitive. Accuracy too. Does anyone know who this is or who it looks like? So basically they were modeling it after So now the funny thing is, though, is that when the developers made this model, I said, that's Bill Clinton. And they said, who? They said, what? Because the team, there was a Japanese team who made this character, and so they weren't as familiar with the U.S. president. So, but I know he's not exactly the same, but it's just but he also had a southern drawl when the character talked. So I'm just this is really similar. So you could, and so part of the problem too, though, now if someone was to perceive that this is Bill Clinton, one of the things that we had to take out of the game is that this president in the game used the term the final solution. We all know the historical problem with that term. And so that was a huge issue. So you could be saying that, well, actually President Bill Clinton is in favor of this term, which of course is not true. So it's that kind of thing that people might perceive. Interpretation. So here's a really interesting example of history. So in Age of Empires, this is what history really showed what happened is that the Yamatos in blue in Japan, they invaded the Korean peninsula over there and they took over the Choson Empire in red. That's what really happened. So when Age of Empires was released in Korea, the Korean Ministry of Information said that never happened. So then what are you supposed to do? So basically what we ended up doing eventually was creating a patch only for Korea that showed the opposite. So the Choson are actually invading Japan instead. And so this is a matter of interpretation. A lot of people would say, well, that's completely erroneous. It's like they should not do that in a historical game. Yeah, but guess what? Age of Empires also had tanks in the Aztec Empire. Aztecs never had tanks. The Aztec tanks were cool, but that doesn't mean, there are inaccuracies in Age of Empires. It was not meant to be exactly precise history. But this is obviously a huge issue when we basically have to turn around and say, okay, well, they have a completely different interpretation of history. Or appropriateness. This is pretty straightforward. Killing Sikhs inside the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which is the most sacred site to the Sikh faith. That's pretty controversial. So that's like, gunning down Catholics in St. Peter's in Rome or, gunning down Muslims in Mecca. It's like you just don't do it. That's a sacred site. And so that's probably not going to be appropriate. The other thing that's interesting is that these are not just single variable things. A lot of these examples can be like both inaccurate or inappropriate. Like this one was interesting where they were striving for accuracy in this simulator where you try and kill John F. Kennedy in Dallas. So you try and assassinate him from the book depository. And so the guys who made this game said, well, it's just a historical simulation. It's like, but it also kept score. And it wanted you to try and do a better job. And it's like, well, that's a game. But so a lot of people felt this is highly inappropriate, but it's also highly accurate. They did an incredible job of recreating Dealey Plaza in Dallas and recreating the whole scenario. Well, if you watch the Oliver Stone movie, though, then it's all baloney, right? So let's talk about fictional world context now. So the primary issues that happen in the fictional world is sometimes we have generalization that happens where the developers kind of lump everything together where it's like, well, all of these cultures are the same, which kind of started happening in Jade Empire when we were creating that game, is that the idea that it was going to be a Pan-Asian culture, and yet in the initial form, it was like 80% Chinese, about 5% Japanese, 5% Korean, and the rest was Hindu. And so it was kind of a weird mishmash of stuff, but it was heavily dominant in Chinese. And so, but the way that they had originally created it was sort of generalizing all those cultures as if to say they're all equivalent and they're all the same, which would be incredibly offensive. Emulation this is probably the biggest issue in fictional worlds, and I'll give an example in a minute. But emulation is basically where you create something in your fictional universe that feels very much like something that exists here. Probably the number one thing I've seen in all my years is when they have a desert culture in a fantasy game that, my goodness, they look awfully Arab to me. Like every single one of these cultures and every single one of these games have the same Arabic Bedouin looking feeling to them, and it's like they just can't seem to depart that. Allegory is another big one as well, where basically you're suggesting something through the fictional universe, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then the use of artifacts too. This is a huge problem. This kind of relates to the backfilling and cultural evidence I mentioned before, where basically you're just throwing stuff in the environment to try and flesh out the environment, but you're putting things in there that may or may not actually be useful in the fictional world or might not fit with the logical consistency. So a generalization. So this game got a lot of bad press because basically what they did is they took these different sets of deities, like the Norse gods and the Egyptian gods, but they also put in the Hindu gods. Now, yes, the Norse gods and Egyptian gods are still worshipped by a very, very small minority of human beings, whereas the Hindu faith is, like about 1 billion people. So, basically doing this equivalence and saying that, well, the Hindu gods are just the same as these other antiquated gods, so we're just going to throw them in a mix and have them fight each other. That's a level of generalization that's not very acceptable. So, and so that can be potentially problematic, making that assumption. Or emulation, again, not picking on the Hindu faith, but this is a good example where this creature, this elephant demon, originally looked a lot like the god Ganesha. And of course, in this game, the elephant demon was an evil character that tried to kill you, whereas Ganesha in the Hindu faith is a very benevolent, very much a loved figure in their pantheon. And so to create a character that emulates this, now the one you're seeing here is near the final form, whereas in its original form it looked a lot more like this, including another set of arms, which was, I think, a kind of an obvious thing that had to be lost. But emulation happens a great deal when creating fantasy games. And allegory as well. So if you don't know the story about the dervish and the arbiter character, if you have not played Halo, just to set this up really quick, this character, he serves a group called the Covenant, which is a kind of quasi-religious alien group. They worship the Halo rings that can destroy the galaxy. The Master Chief, main character of the game, is trying to stop them. And so, and that's basically the really, really short story. So this character, though, was originally called the Dervish. Dervish is a title from Sufi Islam, a specific title, very much the same way that Pope is a very specific title from Roman Catholicism. And so the original name of this character was Dervish. He serves one of three leaders of the Covenant, one of whom is called the Prophet of Truth, which is an often used synonym for Muhammad. And so you've got the Dervish serving the Prophet of Truth, and you've got the Master Chief, who is basically this quasi-American figure. I know it says UN Space Command on his shoulder, but come on, he's got an American accent and all that. So, so he's trying to destroy the Covenant and stop them. And where the allegory starts getting built up here is that this was the first major game being released by Microsoft after 9/11. It was going to be one of the biggest games of the year. So it was very easy, at least for me, to see how people could perceive this as being an answer to 9/11. Where it's like, oh, so the Master Chief is going to destroy Islam because you've got the Prophet of Truth and the Dervish helping the Prophet of Truth and all this kind of stuff. And so that builds up a sense of allegory that you are basically passing a message through this story. Now, there's a lot of great ways to do allegory in fiction. We see it all the time. Like the original Star Trek series was masterful at doing allegory, where they were dealing with racial issues and gender issues, but they did it in such a way in the science fiction realm that made it okay, made it more palatable for the late 60s. So we have to be really careful about the messages that we're sending. I'm not saying you can't put a message into your game, into your fictional universe. We see it all the time. And you look at stuff like Dragon Age. There's all kinds of stuff in Dragon Age about racial relations between the elves and humans and all that. And I think it's great that they do it. We just have to be really careful about what that allegory is saying and how it might relate to something in the real world. And then, of course, artifacts, too. So here's a great example in this game, Pocket God, where this artifact here, now the developer, they got pushback from the Polynesian community because a lot of Polynesian people were upset because of the way these little natives look, because of the very antiquated version of an indigenous person with a bone in their hair and a grass skirt and all that stuff. But the real issue here is that the developer said, well, this is no specific culture at all. It's like, really? Well, that thing right there is a moai that only exists on Easter Island. So by putting a moai on the island, you've instantly made this the Easter Island culture. So that artifact pegged this particular game to a specific culture. Now, in later versions of the game, they actually changed it so that it's a different statue. It's not the actual moai. So it's just simple things like that. Now, there are a lot of shared issues between the real world and fictional world. So logical consistency, again, I'm going to keep mentioning that because it's such an important issue in world creation. It's always an issue whether you're dealing with real world or fictional world. Fictional world, it tends to be a bigger problem because you're creating things from scratch. And so you have more effort to actually make that world feel real as opposed to actually starting with a real world environment. Managing the creation of cultural evidence, which I've mentioned. Now, product versioning by language and locale is also very important. So the Age of Empires example I gave you about Korea, by having to make that fix, you now have two versions of the game. You've got the world version and you've got the Korean version. And so now you have to manage all of these versions, like these different perceptions of your content, different, so that's something that gets really complicated very quickly. And then, of course, the discoverability of issues, which I already mentioned. So, talking about degree of complexity. So, what level of detail is required to realize the game's world for the intended experience? That's really the question you have to ask yourself. And again, I'm going to keep harping on the notion it's not about realism, it's about realization. You may not have to do much anything to make that world work for what you intend for your game. And so you really have to step back and think about it. What's the most minimal amount I need to do to make the game work? And then you can think about maybe embellishing a little bit if necessary. So one of the things geographers are really good at is we are very good at the realization of worlds, because we spend all this time deconstructing this one. And we deconstruct like no other. That's what we do. And so we tear this world apart, at least in our heads, and we try and figure out what's where and why are things there and all that kind of stuff. Now, cartography has always done this. Cartography is about it's about rebuilding the world, because all cartography is subjective. If you look at a map and you think it's an accurate document, you're fooling yourself, because every single map it goes through a subjective process through cartographers who make decisions about what's going to show up on the map. Now, yes, cartographers are committed to showing ground truth to make sure that what you see on the map is actually there, but you're not going to see everything that's there, because you can't put everything on the map that's there. And so what we do is we conveniently divide the world up into layers. We've done this in our heads for centuries as cartographers, but now with geographic information systems, it's made it very explicit, because this is how geographic information systems work. The world is divided up into layers. They have a base layer that is, quote, real world. It has the geoid and all the other stuff that it's built on, and they just have every kind of layer you can imagine on there. And in the same way, when we build worlds, we kind of do the same thing. Now, maybe we don't think about it this way, but that's one of the things I would hope people do think about it this way, because they really should start thinking about the kind of the layers of the world that they're creating. And you may or may not need some of the layers. So I'm just going to talk about a few of these potential layers. Well, I'm not going to really go into in detail. I'm just going to list them so you can see some of the potential layers. And I mean, this is just scratching the surface. I can go down this list that's going to go to the center of the earth. It's like there's so many things you could potentially represent in your world. And you may not need all of these. You may need only one of these. You may need none of these, depending on what kind of world you're creating. And so it's like, of course, there's sub-layers for all this kind of stuff. You take demographics alone, and you think about the level of demographics in terms of genders and age, ethnicities, all of that kind of stuff. So it's very complicated. It gets very complicated very quickly. But in my experience, I mean, this is a natural thing for cartographers to think this way. But in my experience in working with game designers and a lot of the people who do flesh out the world, I don't encounter them thinking like this. Maybe it's not useful for them. I don't know. I've often found that when I kind of talk through with them, when I give them my feedback, I sort of break it down this way and say, well, I want to understand the way your world is built, because it's going to help me do my job better when I'm actually looking at your content later. So if I can understand it in a way that kind of breaks it down like this, and a lot of times they found this more helpful, because then they realize that maybe in the way that the narrative unfolds in their world, maybe the climate actually makes a difference in their game. They weren't really thinking about the climate necessarily, but all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, there's all kinds of cool stuff we could do with weather that we weren't thinking about. And of course, back to something like this, just to use this example again. So I'm talking about geomorphology as an example. So geomorphology, landforms and how they get made, and plate tectonics and all that. Now, as a kid, when I first read Tolkien, I thought this was a wonderful map, and I still do. I love this map. But now as a trained geographer, I look at this map and I say, those mountains around Mordor are ridiculous. They would not form this way. Now, of course, then the geek in me, I have this inner battle between the geographer and the geek, because the geek is saying, yeah, but what about maybe Morgoth went there and Morgoth used his magic and he made the mountains go up as like a giant wall around Mordor or something. That could happen, right? And so, it's just like, I'm not going to second guess Tolkien and why it looks that way, but it kind of, when I look at the map of Middle Earth, it's one of those things where I'm like, that doesn't feel real to me. But then again, it's like, it's so ingrained in my psyche at this point. So I don't have a ton of time left. I'm going to talk about these last few problematic layers really quickly. So these tend to be the layers that can be the most problem for you. Now, I've touched on some of this stuff already. That's why I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. But these are the ones that consistently, time after time after time, have tripped up game developers when they've been building their worlds. So history, of course, is one of the biggest ones. When you're dealing with real-world history, I already gave you an example with Age of Empires. When you're dealing with fictional world history, it's about emulating, and I'm going to keep saying emulation emulating because, again, I mentioned earlier, it's one of the biggest problems with fictional worlds where you're trying to emulate a certain thing. Like if you're going to do like the Battle of Pearl Harbor, but you're going to do it in a fictional setting, maybe you can get away with it, but it depends what level of connection you want the player to have to that event. So if you have like some invasion in space that kind of emulates the Battle of Pearl Harbor, it's like how obvious you're going to make it. So it depends. Oh, we already talked about that. Sorry. So with something like this is for real world example, like this game came out, or they want it to come out recently, about the revolution in Iran. Of course, the Iranian government does not like this at all. They don't want to relive this history. They don't want to see this as a game by any means. I've actually played it. I thought it was pretty cool. I thought it gave a lot of insight into what was going on and the attitudes that were on the street and how it kind of fomented and grew. Faith, of course, that might be a no-brainer. That's one of the areas where with real world, obviously you steer clear, or be very careful with real world religions as much as you possibly can, extremely careful. But one of the things I see a lot in fantasy games or fictional games is they want the player to sense that there's a belief system, and so they often mimic a belief system that exists already. And the most often mimicked is Roman Catholicism. I've seen it time and again, replicated in all kinds of different forms, because I get it. You want to convey the notion of orthodoxy. You want to convey the notion of ritual and faith and all that. And the Catholic Church is a very good example of that. But sometimes that can be overdone. And so you have to decide, how much you want to infuse your game with that. I'm going to skip this example. I will use this example. So this is where they recreated the Manchester Cathedral in the UK in Resistance Fall of Man. Of course, this is a real world example. They wanted this to take place in the real world. But the problem is that this being the Church of England's church, the church was not very happy with their church being destroyed in the game. And so now the Church of England actually has something that they call sacred digital guidelines, that if you're going to use any facility of the Church of England, you have to get their approval, even if it's going to be in digital form. Or something like this, where this fighter in this game, if you may have heard about this example recently, this fighter is a Muslim, but when a fighter wins a match in this game, they have random actions that the fighter does. Well, in his case, the random action was he was doing this. He would not do that, and he made sure that they're aware that he would not do that. And cultural identities, of course, this is where we have all kinds of issues around how gender is represented, how nationalities are represented, how ethnicities are represented. The use of stereotypes is very much overdone still in this industry. We can do a lot better than stereotypes. Stereotypes to me are basically lazy creation. It's when people can't figure out some other way to draw a character or to put a different kind of character, so they just take a stereotype off the shelf and throw them into the game because it's easy and it's quick. But all it takes is a little more thought to put in there. And then also the whole idea when we create cultures in a fictional world, we want them to feel plausible. So that means you kind of have to spend the time fleshing them out, which again is something Tolkien did extremely well. And one of the ways he did it was through language, because language and culture are so intertwined. He did an amazing job because, he was a language professor. He used his strength and he developed all these languages for the elves and the dwarves and everything. And that made them feel much more real and plausible. In Resident Evil 5, this was a case where the stark imagery of having this Caucasian male gun down sub-Saharan African villagers was really problematic in the United States, because we have a lot of racial issues in the United States. Now, of course, the developer was saying, what's the big deal? They're zombies. They're supposed to be killed. But the developer didn't really realize, because the developer is in Japan, and they have, in Japan, it's 98% ethnic Japanese. So you're not as aware of the diversity and racial issues there. And so this whole notion of the dark continent and the great white hunter that are very controversial in the Western world is just not something they've been exposed to. And of course, like Lara Croft, I think she's a great example of how she went from being sort of the poster child of sexism and ridiculous proportions to being an amazingly well fleshed out female character in a game. And a lot of this is due to the vision of the later versions that we've had, and like the writing of Rihanna Pratchett, who's given her a whole emotional depth that did not exist before. And she's a very cool character. And cultural systems as well. So there's the general tension that exists between cultures in the real world, and again, emulation in the fictional world. Things like gestures, I mentioned before, gestures are so culturally specific. So even if you have gestures in a game, it can be problematic. So again, like I said, this one, in the United States, or a lot of people know that as rock on, from rock and roll. In the state of Texas, it means hook 'em horns for the University of Texas. And I was told by my Italian friends that it means I'm sleeping with your wife in Italy. So, and then, but of course, here's an image from Dragon Age where it's like they're flipping the bird. So like, okay, well, would they do that in Dragon Age's world? I don't know. Why wouldn't they do this instead? Or this, or this, or this? They're all valid. So, and then of course, geopolitics is another area you have to be very careful about, especially if you're using maps in your game or you're dealing with territories and all that kind of stuff. And, in the fictional world, it's basically, again, if you're augmenting an existing geopolitical scenario or you're enhancing it in some way, you got to be so careful with this because there are some governments that watch this very carefully. So one example, of course, as you might suspect, is China, where they banned Hearts of Iron because Tibet and Taiwan were not being shown as part of Chinese territory. Now, if you've played this game, it's basically like the board game Risk, and so you just try and take over the world, but they were mostly concerned with just those two areas. And the interesting thing, though, is that these games take place in World War II, and the People's Republic of China did not exist until 1949. So the government is actually reinforcing their perception of their sovereignty before they existed. So, which is kind of what they're doing right now in the South China Sea, if you've been following the news. So finally, I am finishing here. So a couple of notes about creative freedom and world building. And again, I apologize this is going so fast because there's a lot to cover here, and I'm barely scratching the surface. But I want to emphasize it's really important that you exercise your creative vision, but you cannot expect that vision to align with other cultures. And so whether it's a real world you're creating, whether it's a fictional world you're creating, you have to be really careful about the world you're building, or at least be conscious of the choices that you're making. And so when you're doing the decisions about setting the context, is it real world or fictional world, where you're figuring out what complexity, so what degree of realization do I need in order to make this world work for the purpose of my game, for the narrative purpose and the experience purpose, and of course the creative process as well. So watching how you backfill the game and doing all the cultural evidence. They have to be a very conscious, a certain stream of consciousness goes into that creative process. And finally, I'll mention this as well, because we are a game industry, and I think most everyone who's in this room, if you're in the game industry, you're in it because you want to make a living off it, right? You're not just a pure artist. You don't live in your parents' loft or basement, and you don't just make games and put them out in the world as pieces of art. Some people do that, and I think it's fantastic, and I'm hoping to see more and more of that happen. However, most of us are here because we are making a living off games, and so when we are in the creation process, we have to weigh this dilemma between pure artistic freedom, doing anything we want, which is perfectly valid. I don't care what you make. I really don't. I'm not the political correctness police. I don't care what you make. So I'm not going to be the one who says, well, that's bad, you can't do that. But if you want to make money off it, especially in certain markets around the world, I will be the one who says, well, that's not going to work here, and it's not going to work there, and it's not going to work there. And so you have to decide what your goals are in terms of actually releasing this content into the world. If you want to be artistic, but you may not get as much money as you want. Or if you want to actually maximize your revenue, then you might have to make decisions that not always agree with your original creative vision. And it's a struggle. It's a struggle that a lot of game developers deal with. And so being conscious of that struggle and kind of thinking it through is really important. Because if you do release a game and it does get in trouble in a certain market because of something that you mistakenly put in your game, some kind of artifact or character or something, it helps to have some conscious decision making around it. So you can explain why you did it. You could just say, well, I don't know, had no idea what I was doing. But it's like, no, I did that because that artifact has a reason for being there in my world, and here's the reasons that back up, they fit the logical consistency and everything else that you developed. So there you go. That's it. Are there any questions? We have about 5, 6, or 7 minutes for questions.
Hello. I wanted to ask about your opinion when someone is creating a fantasy world, examples World of Warcraft, that they're actually mixing elements or switching elements. What I mean by that is if you look at the elf civilization, they have mixed, for example, ancient Greece putting into jungle instead, and for the houses they have mixed some Asian culture, and mixing those together they create like a fantasy culture and architecture. How do you think of that way of creating something fantasy?
I think when that kind of approach is taken, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think a lot of it is in the execution. Exactly like, I think a lot of times for something like that, you have to have an underlying understanding of why that would happen. Now, I'm not saying you have to explain that why to the audience, but I'm saying you need to think through, like, why would that happen? I mean, other than just saying, well, I'm just going to throw that culture with this culture, and they're going to be like in some, fictional place, dealing with each other or something. That to me kind of starts feeling like it breaks the sense of logical consistency. But I'm not, that can be okay, but as long as there's some kind of reason for it, I think, some kind of rationale for why am I seeing like Greeks and some other culture together, in a way that is just not normal, not something that you would expect, because those are cultures that are specifically attached to the real world, and we know what their context was. We know exactly what their context was, and so it's like you have to kind of help explain why are they now in a different context. And so that to me is kind of part of working through the logical consistency argument. It's kind of thinking, okay, just think of the reasons why.
Thank you.
Hi. So, very interesting session. My name is Francesco. We work for OneSky. Our company localized games for developers, studios, and we on a daily basis have this kind of questions. This kind of questions about culturalization. Is my game suitable for that particular market or not? What would be in general like your advice for developers or studios that they are entering like new markets? What are going to be like the best practices that they should follow before deciding if entering that market with their game or not? Because this is also something that I came to discuss with one of our customers in Hong Kong. He was asking me if basically his game was suitable for a market like Turkey, and I told him, be careful, because in Turkey the culture is slightly different from the culture here in Hong Kong. So they are people that they follow like a particular religion, and they are quite attached to some science or to some values. So that was my advice to him. Do you have like some best practices, something to follow, some suggestions that we can also give to our developers when they have to enter like these markets?
Well, it's a great point, because I mean there's so much that has to go into kind of sort of the intelligence gathering of when you're going into a new market. I hate to draw the analogy, but it's very similar to a military operation. I keep going on about tanks and guns and stuff today, but it's intelligence gathering. So that's what market research is. Market research is meant to help you understand what's going on in the market. Now, of course, market research as we know it is typically focused on consumer behavior, which is fine. You need to know that too. So it's helpful to know what kind of games do they play. For example, the illustration I gave about Age of Empires in Korea, the decision to make that patch was driven a lot by the knowledge of the market research, knowing that the Korean players liked real-time strategy games, which a year later, StarCraft came out. We all know what happened with StarCraft in Korea, became a national phenomenon. And so that market research showed that we really should release the RTS game in Korea, and so it's for business reasons, we should make that patch and do it. And so that was informing our decision making around that. So part of it too, I think you also have to look at the kinds of games that are being made locally. And so this is one of the things where I think is a huge distinction with companies that are having so much trouble getting into China. Some games are very successful, but look at a lot of the most popular games in China. They're based on Chinese mythology and Chinese history. You've got a lot of they're drawing upon their own culture to cultivate an interest in the games. And so it's really important to understand what kinds of games are going to be, people are going to find interesting there. Now, a lot of times what you'll find too is that you'll see, like players, they'll want to play like the big AAA game being released in the Western countries, but their government won't allow it for some reason, like one of these cultural or political reasons. There might be a way to make a game that kind of does the same thing, so you're kind of emulating that game style, but doing it in a local way, using a local theme. And so there's a lot of different ways around it. There's a lot of different, you have to think about the political climate. So like, look at some of the games, like do the research, say what kind of games were banned there? What are they looking for that they don't like? Or what games are doing really well? So what games are they allowing and are actually doing very well? Game type, game content, all of that kind of stuff. And so it really kind of mixes together into understanding what is the expectation that we need to serve. And that's really what I focus on. I mean, like when my consulting is usually because they want me to find stuff that's bad. But there's a big part, one of the things I didn't even talk about the whole field of culturalization, but one of the things I often talk about is there's reactive culturalization, which is basically, removing things that can be potentially problematic. But there's proactive culturalization too, in which you're actively trying to make content that's going to be more appealing to a specific market. Fewer companies are doing that now, but I think more and more companies are going to be doing that. I mean, even like when we did Forza Motorsports way back when, the first version, the different language versions had different car sets in them, because we understood that like the Italian version, a lot of the players there wanted to play, well, mostly Italian cars. And like in the US version, you had muscle cars, Mustangs, Corvette, that kind of stuff. Any player could go get any car from the DLC store, but still you wanted to serve up sort of what the local expectation was. And again, that was just a lot of research. And so, I mean, I can go on and on. There's a lot I could say about this, but that's my short answer. Thanks.
Hi. So first of all, thanks again for lots of information in a very short time, very useful. And I have a practical question. So when imagining like different settings, different cultures, not based on Western culture, which is more or less known to some extent to most Western developers, what would be a quick fix for research? Because some teams maybe have the budget to go and fly to other countries, to Timbuktu or Cambodia and do research, but many don't have this possibility. So what would be your suggestion, like to go on the internet, look for books? Practically?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things you can do. I mean, one of the things that I do is I've been doing this long enough, I've made contacts like all over the place. So it helps to have the local voice, or find some local voice that you trust, people who are well informed. They could, and get different opinions as well. So like, for example, one of the things I used to do when I was at Microsoft to help gather opinions is I would reach out to academics. But I not just one, I would like talk to a political science professor in that particular country and get their viewpoint on the politics. Then I would talk to like a professor of media or professor of sociology or something, and geography, of course, and just kind of get a sense of build up for myself an understanding of what is going on there and what the representation might be. Ultimately, though, the academic stuff, that's great, that's informative, and it helps kind of build your knowledge base. But what really matters is how consumers are going to react. And what are they going to like, and what are they going to dislike? And a lot of that is just finding people whose opinion you can trust. Now, sometimes you can do it through the internet, but we all know what happens on the internet. So, but one of the things you could do, like I've actually done this sometimes, like you could go like, there's some of the things like Google Answers or whatever it is, where you can like throw out a question to the world and say, hey, I'm thinking of making a game that does this and this. Would people in Thailand like this? And see what people say. Now, obviously, you're going to have to do a lot of work to separate the signal from the noise there, because you're going to get a lot of noise. But sometimes you actually get a nugget or two that helps inform you to like, maybe I'll go down that research path, because they may have said something that said, I never heard that before. They said that, well, yeah, right now a lot of our players are really into this type of game or into this type of content. Like maybe they're into historical games right now. So that's something you could pursue. And so you kind of have to just kind of throw a very wide net that way. Obviously, market research is helpful but it also costs money. So that's the only problem with it. Not that market research is bad, it's just that a lot of us can't afford it. So, but it's good. I mean, I find a lot of market research out there. There's a lot of stuff that's out there on the internet, just kind of assess what you're finding. I mean, really have to, for lack of better comparison, it's really like writing a PhD, unfortunately. Because it's like you have to take in all of these different sources, kind of sift through it, and that's actually why I love this work so much, because in a lot of ways it's kind of like a crime scene investigation. I've actually used the term cultural forensics before to talk about, like, you're sifting through all of this evidence and all of these signs that there's something going on, but you're not quite sure exactly what it is, and you're not being able to find it out there through market research or whatnot, so you kind of have to figure out for yourself. Then you have to sometimes just throw out a proposal like, I'm thinking about creating a game that does blah, blah, blah for this market, and then kind of see how people react to it. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but yeah.
Very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think we're about done. We're 5 minutes late. Okay, great. Thank you very much.